Hello, my name is Jonathan Ng. I'm of the Center for Presidential History, and today I'm with my colleague, Zach Kahn. We have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Sayuri Shimizu, and it is October 28th, 2023. Thank you, Professor Shimizu, for agreeing to participate in this interview. I was wondering if, to begin, you could talk about your first encounter with the work of Walter LaFeber and sort of the impression that it had on you.
Okay. Well, it was really an eye-opening and almost life-transforming experience to read his work. So the first, I think, the time that I encountered Walt's work is when I was still a college student in Tokyo, Japan. And I took a Cold War history, a senior seminar, I think, and then one of the assigned reading was Walt LaFeber's America, Russia, and the Cold War. And a translation was not available at the time, so I was okay with English at the time, but then all the other seminar participants have to read in English, so it was a lot of struggle for some of my classmates, and then a lot of people dropped out. So it really shriveled into a small group of students, and then we basically read that book page by page by page, and then my undergraduate mentor or advisee who was teaching the class, he was sort of a friend of Professor LaFeber. And she's the one who introduced us to this work. And then it was very interesting in the sense that in those days, we did not have any social media or YouTube. So when you read someone's work, all you get is the printed name and the material that's printed on these pages. So you start to really fantasize and imagine what this great scholar looks like. And I started thinking that Walt might be really a crabby looking old guy. And then when I finally, I cannot remember in what context that I got to see his portrait. And he was this really sweet-looking, Midwestern-looking, really nice man. And I was like, well, this is not what I imagined him to be. So in that sense, it was just interesting, sort of a gap between what I imagined him to be, totally a superficial imagination, and then what he really looked like. And then also to talk about, so I was going to Japan, and at the time that the United States really is the most important aspect of Japanese foreign policy, and then also, at least in the post-war period, United States is really the brightly shining star for the Japanese society and populace in so many ways. So for this idea that American scholar who has a job at a respected institution like Ivy League school, like Cornell, criticizes American foreign policy in such a way was, to me, shocking. At least in Japan in those days, in the early 1980s, that it was almost unthinkable that scholars who have a job in a respectable institution would criticize the foreign policy of the Japanese government in that way. So to me, that was really eye-opening and almost, life-transforming experience that someone like him, who has a job at Cornell University, would be so critical of American foreign policy. So that was really the first taste of that I got of what it means to be a public intellectual and a scholar, not so much in Japan, but in the United States. And then I began to fancy myself to go to the United States to pursue a PhD in history myself.
Well, those are wonderful, vivid memories. If I'm not mistaken, I think America, Russia, and the Cold War went through 10 editions or something like that. I mean, it was phenomenally influential.
Yes.
And one thing that you talked about, which really caught my attention, was how LaFeber was part of a very prestigious institution in the U.S., and yet he had a very critical eye toward what the United States was doing abroad. Would you like to maybe elaborate more about what stuck out to you in particular in his writing, in his book, the elements that maybe influenced you then, or particularly strongly, and perhaps continue to inform how you approached the field of history as you pursued your graduate studies.
Well, one of the things that really influenced me when I first read this book, and then also some of his Walt's other articles, is that when he talks about the Vietnam War, and he also talks about the influence of Japan in U.S. foreign policy thinking that got the United States to make the first step in intervention into Southeast Asia. And this whole notion that even thinking about U.S.-Vietnamese relations, the bilateral relations, but you have to really understand that bilateral relations in the larger framework of trilateral or just a larger global framework that shapes that bilateral relations. That kind of approach is something that not many Japanese diplomatic historians were doing at the time. So this was really, again, eye-opening experience for me, and then that really continues to really shape my approach to things, that even the bilateral relations has to be understood in the multivalent, multilateral context that Walter LaFeber was just so effective in doing. So.
That's a very great explanation of the appeal and the uniqueness of his argument and his optic. In the anthology, Thinking Otherwise, you have a very lovely memory of calling Walter LaFeber on the phone. I think it was
1986, I think. Yeah, that was, yeah.
And you were calling the office at Cornell, and then unexpectedly LaFeber talks on the phone. Could you perhaps talk about the background to that, the process of applying for a graduate school, and then maybe what that conversation was like?
Okay, well, as I became much more involved in the study of U.S. foreign relations and became much more familiar with Walter LaFeber, I started having this fantasy that maybe I may want to pursue a PhD under his direction. And so I was fortunate enough to get a Fulbright scholarship. At least in those days in Japan, that was the scholarship to get, and then to have the Fulbright and then be able to pursue a PhD in the United States was really the ultimate prize. So anyway, I was just so jumping up and down. But then I really wanted to study with Walter LaFeber, but then a Fulbright scholarship, or the Fulbright Commission in Japan, requires you to apply to at least 7 graduate programs. So that's really sort of a hedge against you getting a Fulbright scholarship and not getting into any American programs to actually use that scholarship. So I applied to 7, but so Cornell was my number 1 choice because Walter LaFeber was somebody that I wanted to study with. But then I got accepted pretty quickly, and I got the acceptance letters from 6 institutions very quickly. I think by early January, I already got acceptance letters from these 6 institutions. But Cornell, I did not hear from Cornell. Then, I kept thinking, well, maybe February I will hear from them, March. And then April 15th was the last day that I have to tell the Japanese Fulbright Commission that which school I have decided to go to. And I still have not heard from Cornell, so I was just freaking out. And then, so I think that was April 13th, so I'm really close to the deadline that I have to inform the Japanese Fulbright Commission that I just decided to call the history department. And in those days, in the mid 1986, I think, it was very still expensive to call international. The Japanese international telephone service was a monopoly of one company at the time, and the market was not deregulated yet. So it was very expensive. I cannot really recall at the top of my head, but it was something like $20 a minute, or the first 3 minutes or so. Really, and the $20 is a lot of money in those days. And I was a graduate student, did not have a lot of money. So try to make a phone call to Ithaca, New York was a really big decision, financial decision on my part too. But then I called, and then I was transferring to different, and then the clock was ticking, so I was like sweating. Sweat was beating down my face because I was like, another $20, another $20. And then so I finally got to talk to the graduate, I think, director of graduate studies, Dr. James John. And then she said there has been some kind of paperwork mess up or whatever, that I had been already admitted, but then somehow the acceptance letter had not gone out. And he was just explaining these things, and he said, "Oh, I just saw Walt walk across the hallway, and I'm gonna go get him." And then I was, "What?" Like, and then he, a couple minutes later, then he was put on the phone, and he said, "Hello, Sayuri." And then, well, this was really like, my goodness, I was right over my head. I mean, this is Walter LaFeber. And then not only that, he's called me Sayuri. And then in those days, at least in Japan, the man, unless somebody is your like a wife or girlfriend, they don't call a woman or girl by their first name. I mean, this is just a different social convention. But then his first thing out of his mouth over the phone was, "Hello, Sayuri." And Walter LaFeber called me Sayuri. And then I was almost ready to just fall out of my, and so I was so silly. I was almost like a starstruck little girl. And I could not really, got tongue-tied, and I could not say anything, but Walter LaFeber was just so welcoming, and then he apologized for whatever paperwork mixed up that occurred, and then he's very looking forward to working with me. And then he said that there was another graduate student that he admitted who was Jim Sigmeyer, and he thinks that he and I will have a very good time working with him as well. So he was just so warm and then so welcoming. And this is really this big name, this the Ivy League professor that I just dream about. For him to just address me as a Sayuri, and then also to be so welcoming and so down to earth. And then this is at least in those days in Japan, the college professors don't talk to students that way. Not that nice to them. And let alone famous professors. So Walt was everything, like so warm and friendly, and then just so down to earth. And so he was really the polar opposite of what I knew the college professors to be as a young Japanese graduate student in Japan in the mid 1980s. So it was just he was just something else.
Thank you for sharing that beautiful memory. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about your experience in graduate school as well. What was it like to work with him? Were there particular lessons that you learned? Maybe ways about doing your craft, or perhaps tips from his teaching that you learned?
Okay, well, one of the things that first thing that I learned from Walt, and then I think I even mentioned this in my little write-up for Walt's memory in the collected volume, is that so I was a product of the Japanese educational system, and in that system, at least in those days, it may be different now because I haven't been there for many years, many decades. So, but at least in those days, in order to excel in the Japanese academic system, is just to memorize. If you have a good memory, and if you can just rattle off all the things, that information you take in, then you are a good student. And then the measure of a good student or a good scholar is how much you can remember and memorize stuff. So that was my idea of achieving academic excellence. And from the day one of the graduate seminar, which was just Walt and Jim Sigmeyer and myself, and we were talking about the book, and I was rattling off what the author says, and he would always just sort of lean over and say, "So Sayuri, what do you think?" And I was like, I didn't know how to respond to that kind of question. What do you think? Like, I mean, what do you mean? Like, this is a book written by this person, this scholar, and this is what he is saying about this subject. And Walt will just look straight into my eyes. I'm asking what you think, and how do you analyze this thing? Like, how do you approach this question? And there was this awkward silence because I just didn't know how to really even approach that kind of the framing. And then So this was really the first semester that he really forced me to even come to terms with this very novel idea that I'm supposed to form my own opinion about scholarship or any historical question. And he was so patient. What do you think? How do you approach this question? Or what kind of question do you frame? And it must have been a sort of a baffling experience for Walt too. I mean, I'm sure that he has some international students, graduate students before, but just to have to deal with some international student, graduate student who have been a product of such a different academic tradition, and for him to keep asking the same question, what do you think? And then he was so patient, and that was really sort of almost like a refrain in my brain. And then so even after I stopped being his graduate student and becoming a scholar on my own, he really pounded in my head the most important question that I should be asking is, what do I think?
Well, I think that's a beautiful illustration of one of the core parts of that volume, which is the idea of thinking otherwise, which of course is the reference to the historian Carl Becker, who said a historian is someone who thinks otherwise, someone who encourages students to think differently. Maybe continuing to reflect on your graduate experience with LaFeber, and also if you worked as a teaching assistant with him or saw how he went about doing teaching in other contexts, what do you remember of those years, and are there other elements of his teaching that stuck out to you?
Well, his lecture skills, I mean, everybody who come through Walter LaFeber's lecture room knows that he does not look at any notes. And everything is just so well structured and seamlessly argued. And it was almost like hearing this story, beautifully crafted story. And then he just finishes 50 minutes, like just to the point, like a minute. It was just such a precision, with the precision that he constructed this self-contained question. And also there was an interesting segue to the next lecture that he's going to talk about. So he just sort of raises this anticipation for what may come in the next lecture. So he was very good about putting students in this cliffhanger kind of thing. So that his lecture skills was really the gold standard. I always remember when I started doing a lecture myself and being an assistant professor, a newly minted PhD professor, then I always have to look at my notes. And just that fact really got me really disappointed in myself, because Walter LaFeber never looked at the notes. And then also I would go back and forth, or my lecture was not that coherent, so it doesn't have a beautiful narrative structure. I would really get so despondent about it. So one time I remember one of the times that I talked to Professor LaFeber about how did you get to be such a great, phenomenal lecturer, and were you born that way? And he said, no, hard work. And that was really his 2 words, hard work. And even somebody who is just so seamlessly, so naturally be such a phenomenal speaker, the name of the game was hard work. So this was a really important lesson for me. So I kept doing the hard work, and nowadays I think I don't look at the notes anymore. So that's something that Walt taught me how to do.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I get the sense that LaFeber is sort of the gold standard of teaching for so many people that he mentored.
Yes.
For several other people we had the privilege to talk to, they also said they've tried to teach with that outline that LaFeber would write on the board, or that they'd try to teach without notes, but it was almost impossible for them to replicate what LaFeber was doing, because he did it with such extraordinary skill.
Yes, yes, it was. But then I still used the same thing. He would write this outline or some 3 themes on the blackboard, and I still do it with a projector or the YouTube, not a YouTube, canvas that I have a 3, and this is something that I learned from LaFeber, and then my pale imitation of what he did, and then Excellent.
I was wondering if we could also talk a bit about his book, The Clash. It's my understanding that you really played an instrumental role in
Oh,
helping
wow.
move that book. Could you talk about what the process was like of really collaborating with LaFeber on that important project?
Well, that was a really another special experience I had the good fortune of having too. So when he started writing it, I think it was 1994 or 1995 or something around that time, because I was between my jobs at the time, and I was married to my professor husband who taught at Ithaca College. So I was living in Ithaca. I was in between my jobs, and I just had a baby. So anyway, so I really did not have much to do except changing diapers. But anyway, and I was just so frustrated and stuff. And then he was asked by the publisher to write this book, even though that's not his specialty, because at the time Japan was really posing economic threats to the United States, and there was all kinds of doomsday scenario of Japan would take over. This was the time that when Japan was still a superpower, right? I mean, my students who grew up after the new millennium, they don't even know what it means that Japan used to be a superpower. So they think that Japan is just a country of Pikachu and Hello Kitty. But anyway, so this was the time that the U.S.-Japanese trade friction was really big deal, and Walt was asked to write this book, but then he understood that he does not read Japanese, but it's very important to include Japanese voices that can only be retrieved from Japanese language sources. So that's one reason I think he came to me that I'm asked to do it, and I'm going to do it, but it would just help me with the translation. But I really do think that his real reason for asking me to be part of this project is that he really wanted to help me get through that tough in-between job year with the change to the baby, and he really wanted me to help me out. And he was very generous with how much he would pay for my translation work. But not only that, he would just ask questions about my translation that indicated to me that he wasn't just using me as a translator. He was asking these really fine points or nuance of my translation or interpretation as a scholar, that's an equal scholar. That sense was so, I don't know, just moving to me that he's not just using me for my translation, but he is engaging me as co-equal scholars. And that kind of respect that he accorded to me as a very, very junior scholar was really moving to me. And another thing is that by him helping me this way, and I always tell this to my other LaFeber students too, that Walt has been very, very, I think, conscious about helping female scholars achieve their goals and advance in the professions. And that's one reason why that toward the end of his career, mentorship at Cornell, then he would accept many female students. And I really do believe that the way that he invited me to be part of the project as a translator / co-worker was really his way to help this young female, not so young, but female junior scholar, and not to allow her career to be derailed just because she just had a baby and she had to live in Ithaca, change to her husband's job and stuff. So I really do think that was his way of really encouraging young female scholars. So, and he was just so respectful, and he would not set any schedule or deadlines for I don't or he was not like, I have worked did some translation for other scholars too, but they would always say, here's what I want you to translate, and I want the translation by this deadline. He was not like that at all. He would just say, well, this is the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. Can you go and research in what kind of the Japanese sources out there, and give me the translation, but he never set the deadline. And later on, I found out through the grapevine something else, that he never did that because he knew I had a baby. And he was ready to accommodate. Whenever I could do it, then I would do it, and that was fine with him. And I'm sure that it really was not ideal situation in terms of timetable and meeting deadlines, that he would give me such a leeway as to when I would do the translation. But that's how he did, and how he treated me as his co-worker. So.
Well, that's a really, I think, a beautiful testament to his character.
Yes.
And also to another theme that some people have talked about, which is how he really was a good mentor, not simply to graduate students or to undergrads, but to people who are former students and colleagues who he really cared about their careers long after they were
Oh, yes. And then he would actually, at my first book manuscript too, I think he gave 3 rounds of reading for my first manuscript, and then other things that I've written, he was very, he's one of those very few senior scholars who actually read junior scholars' work and then offer and return feedback. He was very good about that, and he was very good about it too. But, well, I felt so bad about almost like taking up so much of his time, because, I mean, he's this great scholar, and I felt so guilty about making that kind of demand on his time. So when I published my second book, I did not ask him, send him any manuscript, because I knew that he would read it and then give me really detailed feedback. So consciously I did not do it. And then the book that came out, my second one, was that baseball book. And Walt, when it came out, and Walt was just so crushed, and like he said, like, I did not know you were a jock, and I would really enjoy this reading this book, and then we're giving you feedback. So he was just like in a sort of a sweet, I don't know how, but yeah, sweet, kind of cute way. And he said, "How come you did not give me this manuscript before it was published?" And another thing related to that particular exchange is that. I was an international student, so I used to always carry this little English-Japanese dictionary, and then whenever I hear words that I did not understand, I would just go and then look it up. So that was something I would do, and Walt knew that that's what Sayuri does. But anyway, and even in those days, that day, I think it was after many years after graduating from Cornell, but I still carry the little a dictionary. And when Walt said that, so I didn't know you were a jock, and I did not know that you were a jock. So I started doing, and Walt was like, "No, you don't need to know." So he was a very, very sweet man.
Yeah, I'm thinking about sort of your development as a scholar and how that overlapped with his development as a scholar as well. I'd be curious to hear your perspective on how LaFeber maybe evolved in his thinking over time. You know, he had such a prolific output of scholarly publications and books, and he was active as a scholar since the 50s when he was in graduate school, really up till he passed, and saw many tremendous developments in the field of diplomatic history, which has become, in some ways, different fields and been informed by different methodologies and philosophies. Could you talk maybe a little bit about how you saw LaFeber develop as a scholar, and also what you think he saw as his key contributions to the field of history?
Okay. The most noticeable evolution as a scholar in Walt that I noticed is that in the mid-1980s, that American diplomatic history, or the scholarship in general, it's all about English language sources, and then it's also the knowledge production was basically exclusive to English-speaking scholars, and that was fine at the time in the profession. But I know from my former professor in Japan too that Walt was one of the very few American scholars who would actually be interested in what non-American scholars, non-European, non-Anglo-American foreign scholars have to say about topic, or how they formulate questions, or what kind of separate historiography exists outside of the English language historiography. And he was actually one of the very few at the time who would ask and invite these foreign scholars to be part of this academic conversation. And he always had that, but then even now, I think over the years that I work with him and also help him write the clash, and just in general that his really attentiveness to non-American historiography and what kind of questions are being asked and formulated by foreign scholars that are not necessarily part of the Anglo-American academia. That was something that I really, really noticed that Walt began to do. So, and I really admire him for that. So
that's great. Another thing that I'm curious about is the relation between LaFeber's politics and his scholarship. When I think of books like Inevitable Revolutions, for instance, it seems clear that he wrote it with a very rigorous understanding of that history, using the best methodologies available, but that clearly he was concerned about contemporary issues. And yet, my understanding is that he was also sometimes reluctant to editorialize or to express his own political views, particularly in the classroom. I'd be curious to hear your take on the relationship between his politics and his scholarship.
Well, that's something that really intrigued me because his scholarship, is inflected with his deeply committed concerns as an intellectual and as very social issues. So, and a lot of scholars of his stature not gun shy about expressing their political views pretty expressively in their scholarship too. But you can tell that Walt is a deeply committed scholar, and he cares about social justice and all these other admirable values, but he's so measured. He is just like, even in the classroom, he might make some comments or some quips or some jokes about it, but he was always so measured and so subtle. And he just does not wear his politics on his sleeves. And to me, that gap between his deepness of his political commitment and his measuredness in terms of delivering his scholarship and then also delivering orally his knowledge and scholarship in the classroom. Where did this gap come from? And also this, when going back to the time that I was in Japan and fantasizing about Walt, and because of his critical edge of his scholarship about American foreign policy, so I just thought of him as this hippie kind of person, like long-haired hippie, like a crabby-looking hippie. But then he's always impeccably dressed, and he comes with a suit and jacket and tie, and then in that kind of really, but then he goes off and says pretty radical criticism in a subtle way of American foreign policy or other social issues that are central to U.S. Democracy and institutions. So that gap of his measuredness and his measured attire, and then also, but then the essence of his really his social commitments and his radical politics, the gap is something that really stands out to me. And then I don't know, like even now, that how he can be so measured and have that kind of discipline in just basically being so measured in his expression then, but then at the same time he's so deeply committed.
Yeah, I wonder if almost it was part of the reason that perhaps he struck this balance is because he realized that if he wasn't always expressing his point of view so openly, perhaps it would give him more credibility.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, exactly. And then he really managed to continue to be a very respectable voice within the profession, or even the policy makers even respected him because of that kind of balance, or the I would even say his self-discipline, really.
Maybe thinking about the broader legacy of LaFeber, do you see in your own work today sort of traces of his influence on your pedagogy and your research or other aspects of your life?
Oh yes, well, my lecture style is definitely Walter LaFeber's imprints all over the place. I did going back to the thing about I have 3 points, and then nowadays I don't even look at it, and I just pace around, and that was that kind of superficial level. This is really his deep influence or footprint of me as well. But then I think going back to the same point that. The way that the Walt expresses his social concerns and deep social the political commitment in his scholarship in a very measured way, instead of just saying it like, well, this is what I stand, kind of really loud way. So that kind of a self-discipline, but then also deep commitment, and how you are supposed to express that commitment through your scholarship is something that I always aspire to, and I think if there is any kind of a thread running through my scholarship at this age is that same kind of the measured commitment, measured expression of your political commitment through my scholarship too. And then also another, as many people I'm sure that have expressed this point, that Walt is always willing to listen to other people, other points of view, and he always invites other people to express oppositional opinion, and then he just listens to them and he integrates them into his ever-evolving scholarship. So that kind of attitude towards knowledge production, just the collegial level that you listen to what other people say, this is something that I think I learned from him, and I always remind myself to do, because that's how he set the example, and I think I owe it to Walt to be that way.
That's a fantastic reflection. Are there any other memories or thoughts that you would like to put into the record?
There are so many records that, this is okay. This is kind of a funny, not funny, but then, so you've done a PhD, right? So you know, like after you pass your PhD comprehensive exam, then you become an ABD, a PhD candidate, but you go through a year or two where you are just sort of wobbly and then floundering for a thesis topic, and you do a lot of reading, and a lot of thinking, but you don't have anything to show for to your advisor, and you start avoiding your advisor because you are just too embarrassed that you don't have any chapters to show anything. So I went through that process in my third year and fourth year at the Cornell, and then there is the Cornell, graduate library is the way it's structured, and there's a mirror in the corner, and when somebody is coming out of the elevator, then you can see that so and so is coming out from the mirror. Then every time, like I go there and then I see Walt coming out of the elevator, I just run as fast as I can, because I was just too embarrassed to just not to have anything to show for to him. So I go and then see him coming out of the elevator, and I run and as fast as I can. And there was one time that I don't know why I was running, but my colleague said, why are you going to run into Walter LaFeber? Because every time people see me run, they just assume that I was running away from Walt. So this is the kind of awe and then that he inspired in this Lori graduate student.
That's very funny. I also wanted to talk to you about LaFeber's love for baseball, which obviously had some resonance with the research that you went on to.
Yeah.
Did he ever talk to you about his passion for the Cubs?
No, actually he didn't. That's why that he wasn't even aware that I liked baseball, because he never talked about sports. I don't know why he did not, because I know he did that to many of his graduate students, but so maybe he just assumed that I wasn't interested in sports, or I don't know, but he never talked to me about baseball. That's why I never showed him that side of me, the jock side, jock side of me. So I never got to see that aspect of him. So that was a really big loss on my part.
Well, this has been a phenomenal interview.
Well, thank you. And it's some funny things, right? That he just makes his graduate student ran us away from him as fast as she can.
I think that's I can definitely relate to that as
Me
a former
too.
graduate.
Yeah, you can, right?
Yeah. I think it has maybe it's especially understandable in your case, just given the gravitas of
Oh, yes.
LaFeber and just how he's such a phenomenal, important pillar in the field.
Yes.
But,
Thank you very much for this opportunity to do this interview with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.